Marshall and Saagar here. Welcome back to the Realignment. So, we are recording this episode before Trump's inauguration, but considering the start of this podcast really being shaped by Saagar and my experiences during the first Trump presidency, I thought this was like the perfect time, and you're the perfect person, Saagar, to talk through what Trump 2 means for DC. That said, I would love, because folks love when you kind of give like the insider outsider sort of read on this. Trump won. Actually, let's not even start there. We met at GW. So we first met during Obama's DC. You have Trump's DC, you have Biden's DC. What differentiates the mood in Washington right now from those three different eras?
I think Trump too, in terms of Washington, is most analogous to '08 and probably to '04. And what I mean by that is it feels like big questions were settled. Businesses can make confident bets. Politicians have a stable, they have a bench that they can draw from. There's a coherent ish agenda that people kind of agree on. Again, there's going to be a lot of inconsistencies. There's still a lot of wars, etc. But it's not even comparable to 2017. And so if you think about '04, Bush is selected, actually similar to Trump. I mean, selected, not elected, 9/11, I mean, it was insane, right? It was totally crazy. And whenever Bush came in, he still didn't really know who he was. And he had all this like incoherent cabinet. By '04, we're in Iraq. He has a general like theory of why he wins re-election. It's ended up being totally wrong, but he has a theory no matter what. He's able to staff out his cabinet and his officials and his White House with some of the same aides, but he has an interpretation that business also buys into. It's important to understand if you think back to '04, we come after the Bush tax cuts. Big business is totally bought in, maybe even more so. The general, like, again, theory with respect to Trump and Bush at that time was, can he really pull it off again? And when he does, and you win the popular vote, and Donald Trump is the first Republican to win the popular vote since 2004, you have this coherence of like the country's conservative. At that time, they were like, the country is evangelical. This is going to guide all Democratic theory, all Republican theory. Under the current one, you really see this with Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and many of these other Fortune 500 CEOs trying to curry favor with Trump. It just feels like big questions are more settled. So I don't think it will be as chaotic as the last time around, but there will still be several inconsistencies. And what that means also for governance is that in terms of governance, what we're going to see is less chaos and less strife. Now, obviously, it's Trump, so you're going to have some, but um, I noticed this. A lot of people who are into politics now, probably our listeners, you might be like 25. So you just like literally don't remember what it was, how insane it was in 2016, 2017, with the wars between Steve Bannon and Reince Priebus and the National Security Council and Michael Flynn. He gets fired after 33 days and General Mattis. I mean, it was insanity. It was just constant warring. I remember by day 90 of Trump, I was like, oh, this shit's just not going to work. I was like, this is just going to be a shit show for 4 straight years, and it was. And I think it will be very, very different this time.
Yeah, and I recorded an episode with Juan Williams of Fox News and NPR about the what he calls the second civil rights movement during the 2010s. So a lot of focus on BLM
Mhm.
and police shootings, all those dynamics, and something that I totally wrote off because resistance, quote unquote, hashtag resistance became so beyond parody by late stage Trump. So Miller, she wrote,
Right.
all those different things. But here's the thing, and he wrote this in the book quite eloquently. 4.1 million people showed up to the Women's March
That's right.
in 2017. And you could disagree with that, but that actually meant something. And hearing that made me sympathetic to how resistancy things were for the first 2 years. Because think about it that way, like 4.1 million people showing up across the entire country, totally unplanned. there wasn't a big organization that did this. Cecile Richards, who was the head of one of the major pro-choice groups, said, quote, if you'd given all of us groups $50 million and 10 years to get 4.1 million people out around the country, we probably couldn't have pulled it off. This
Mm-hmm.
had to be organic. So if you're a Democratic politician, if you're an AOC type, if you're a Joe Biden type, if you're a resistance journalist, I actually totally get why you're like, okay, this is the thing. And quickly that overshoots its skis because resistance was best centered around, wow, this guy didn't win the popular vote. There was a lot of chaos. There are all these things we could focus on, like Comey and releasing the Hillary condemnation a few weeks before the election. There were all these non-cope things that you could build a coherent narrative around.
Yeah, I
That
agree.
all does not exist this time around. And that has to be such a game changer. It must be so uncentering as a resistance oriented person who's not sort of running a late stage bulwark. I don't want to say grift because like they do write, they do produce content, but there's just no noise there. And
Mm-hmm.
all you're basically doing is trying to chop off the dying embers of the 2017 energy. So I'd love for you to talk about the real lack of resistance as really meaning something.
Well, that's where I just don't think you can underestimate the popular vote. The entire theory, the resistance theory of Donald Trump was coherent. It was just wrong. It was that this was an aberration. It was stolen. That's why Russiagate had so much currency, Cambridge Analytica. There was a genuine theory of politics where they believed that nobody could have ever voted for this person if they did not know the truth and if they didn't realize he was a criminal or a convicted felon. Like fundamentally, the argument against Trump was illegitimacy. But when you win the popular vote and you win all seven of the swing states, well, that theory is just incorrect. And so you can debate within the framework of why Trump is bad and why Trump is wrong and why Trump should Trumpism shouldn't, be the enduring legacy. But you have to accept the actual democratic legitimacy. And that's why the day after Donald Trump won in 2016, it was like 9/11 in Washington. I mean, it was just one of the most unexpected and insane events that people in politics had probably experienced, literally probably since 9/11, who actually worked in it. Whereas the day after, it just felt normal. Nobody really was like walking around shell shocked and stunned. I mean, if you listen to this show, I always said there's probably a greater than 50, not greater, there's probably a 50% chance or so Trump could win. I picked Donald Trump to win the election. He actually won much bigger than I thought he would. But that's just what I mean. It was pretty conventional wisdom, I would say. Like to borrow a Peter Thiel thing, it was not contrarian to bet on Trump in 2024, right? I think it was a highly conventional thing. And then when it actually did bear out, sure, we were a little bit unexpected that he would win the overall popular vote, but that only affirms even more the illegitimacy of a lot of the arguments, at least democratically, that were made against Trump. That doesn't mean that there can't be backlash. I really like what a lot of the leftist or like center left people have been talking about, the idea of thermostatic public opinion, which I think is very real.
Can you
And
explain that
people
concept?
still, yeah, thermostatic public opinion is basically like public opinion is not fixed in stone. It shifts around a lot and a ton. So Americans change their mind all the time and in extremely short periods of time. You just look at the last 4 years. Joe Biden wins in 2020. Democrats blow it out in 2022 relative to expectations, and then they lose the popular vote in 2024. I mean, that's crazy. For example, a lot of like people, I actually went back and looked. 96 to 2000 is one of the craziest electoral shifts that has ever happened. Bill Clinton wins resoundingly popular vote, electoral college victory, and then it comes down to basically a split tie in the electoral college, and it's decided by a couple of votes in Florida. That's insane. That only happened in 4 years, guys. Same thing in terms of 2000 and 2000 to 2004. So the point is that big events can happen. People change their minds literally all the time. We went from, the party of or the America is an evangelical Christian war accepting nation to Obama in 4 years. And honestly, we did it in 2 years because by
Yep.
'06 the entire country had soured on Bush. So things can go south so quickly that it's actually difficult for people who are maybe casual, observers to think. And that's just my main reason. And this would be my advice to the business leaders too. Stop like debasing yourself and thinking that things have like fundamentally changed, because they have, but they also haven't. Some of the basics are still pretty coherent. And that's also just a real reason why people should not just go with wherever the wind blows. Like, you should just ground yourself and try and think about things that withstand the test of time. And when they're insane in either direction, like, probably just don't give into that, because you're just going to look like an idiot.
Yeah, I love that. I want to follow up on the thermostatic public opinion thing, but I love your point about don't just go in any one direction. Because, like, what's so the funny thing that I've noticed is obviously Mark Zuckerberg is on a big tour right now. The Rogan episode, the big
Yeah.
interview conversation he did with Stephen Miller from the White House, where he's like, I'm not going to focus on politics. I'm just going to put my head down. Someone, and these are, center left critics here, obviously, so we're going to put that bias in. One of them was just sort of like, what frustrates me about Zuckerberg is just like every 5 years, he
Yeah.
does like this big, big thing. So he does the big speech at Georgetown in 2019, and he basically goes in on the fact checking and all those like different dynamics. And now he's then swinging to this direction and doing the Trump thing. And that's why I like your advice of just like get balanced. You were unbalanced. Or you clearly said things you didn't quite believe in 2019, but you were doing
Right.
because you wanted to stick for what was popular. Well, now you're just going to the other direction. So I think the reason why Zuckerberg's media tour hasn't been received that well by the right. So obviously he's doing the things he needs to do to get Stephen Miller off his back. And obviously the Trump people are going to be looking very aggressively at these different dynamics, but just no one trusts it because everyone, it's like, once again, it's like I get very annoyed when leftists are sort of saying, oh, centrist politics claimed that like all Kamala had to do was like moderate and it didn't work. Therefore, being moderate isn't a way to like win an election where it's like, no, like she went moderate for 3 months, but Americans remembered what she said during the 2019 primaries. And most importantly, they could tell that within herself, her wild swings weren't a result of like, I think thinking things through and having like a center, but more just, I don't know, this, and that. And Zuckerberg hasn't conveyed the sense that he truly within himself like thinks X, Y, and Z. Because that's what you need to do when it comes to trusting people's
Yeah.
POVs. But I really want to talk about the thermostatic public um opinion thing because it both serves the left and it both serves the right. But it's also like this is why it's a warning sign. So perfect example of this. 2016, Trump gets elected under build the wall. So if you are a Republican and you're a Trump Republican, their whole theory of the case was, okay, cool, we've got a mandate to make some big changes. We're going to do a half-assed travel ban on day one. And that's our deal. We are going to do child separation policy because that's our deal. However, there was a gap between, I think, what people interpreted build the wall as meaning, at least the broad center, and then those two punitive policies. People are like, wait, like it seems kind of dickish to have like someone from Iraq who's like on a flight halfway across the Atlantic not being allowed into the country. That wasn't what I voted for when I said build the wall. Therefore, you saw immigration actually swing to the left. Immigration
Yep.
actually became much, much more popular during the Trump presidency because the moves that Trump made at a White House executive order level enforced the Democratic arguments about, hey, this isn't who we are. Once again, these things sound cringe, but like if you think back to 2018, saying, hey, separating kids from their families, that seems kind of jacked up. I wouldn't want to have that happen to my family. Therefore, I'm going to respond to a poll saying I'm actually more in favor of immigration now. Democrats, though, see those poll changes and say, okay, you know what this means? It's the 2019 debate. And like
Hmm.
literally only, I think Joe Biden was like one of the only candidates. And this is why our relationship with Joe Biden is very frustrating because I think Joe Biden in many ways peaked in 2019 to early 2020. I think, he in June 20, I say early 2020, and not November 2020, because in June 2020, he selects Kamala Harris as his VP, which was a horrible decision that he did not have to make at the time. But he says, whoa, I'm not going to, like, Julian Castro is forcing the party to say, oh, yeah, Americans like immigration now, so we're going to decriminalize border crossings. And we're basically going to actually articulate Democratic Party ideas as being akin to open borders.
Yeah.
That's like obviously a controversial term, but like it's basically what they were saying. That then is a disaster because then when the debate in the 2020s isn't, hey, are we separating children? Are we stopping people from flying into the country even though they're coming from Iraq? It's, wait, there's a huge border crisis. And there is a crime wave, and COVID's made everyone pissed off. And there's inflation. Why would we have open borders? That then had Democrats out from like out ahead of their skis. So it's just so important to understand that it's possible. So then this is why I'll throw this question to you then. As you said, certain questions were settled by Trump winning, but I think it's important that we parse out what questions are settled and then how far does that then go? So break down that part of it.
Yeah, I think the big question that was settled was, is Trump a legitimate political figure? And the answer is obviously yes. Is Trumpism a legitimate political movement? I think the answer is yes. Is Now this is, yeah, so you got up a good point on immigration. Like, it would be a mistake to overinterpret it, and it would also be a mistake to underinterpret it. But I actually think it's pretty simple. People want order. And what I mean by that is, I think people are fine with, quote unquote, building a wall. And I think they definitely do want control of the border. But what I mean by that is that they want like adjudication. They don't want to feel as if things are chaotic. And so chaos is really what hurt Donald Trump in 2020. And it's what really hurt Joe Biden throughout the entire period of his presidency. So my number one advice to Trump, to any of these people doing anything, is to have a orderly process. You can actually achieve extraordinary and extreme things as long as it's orderly, as long as it is well executed, well articulated. I mean, I will say this is one reason why I thought it was just a massive mistake to pick Kirstie Noem. I'm like, how are you going to put this woman who shot a dog and then incoherently like bumbles on national television in charge of the largest deportation order in American history? Like, do you really think that that's going to go well? Look, Stephen Miller has actually learned a lot from the travel ban and from everything. He's got lawyers and everything getting papered in a very different way in terms of the way that things with the administrative law and all these other things need to be executed. He learned a lot of that in the first administration. He spent the last 4 years too thinking about it. I think JD Vance is very similar, somebody who's actually thought, what does it actually look like? I also will say it's interesting to see the professionalism kind of mixed with Trumpian rhetoric. So, back in the about what we were going to do with Kim Jong Un, and Trump did his whole like little rocket man. He's got a button, but I've got a much bigger button. The North Korea policy was kind of incoherent, and we never really got to like a big resolution. But this Israel one, I thought, was the best example of what happens with Trumpian panache, style, and professionalism. As in, he was like, Hamas, there will be hell to pay if those guys don't get if the hostages don't get released. So there's the threat. But then behind the scenes, it turns out Steve Witkoff is like dispatched over there and is able to get this thing done in 2 months, which is honestly insane, because it's the exact same deal that has been on the table since May of 2024. So you're like, okay, so what changed? It's like, well, sure, some situations on the ground changed, but really what changed was significant pressure from the American side and from Trump. Trump has intuited, I think, probably a lot from the last 8 years, but how can you not look at the Biden situation and not say that coherence, competence, and lack of chaos is not the single most important thing, both for the global order, but also for the American political system? So, like, globally, a lot of people felt as if the global situation was just out of control, like with Israel, with the protest movement in America, And then you combine that with Ukraine, with Afghanistan, and all of that. And look, I supported the Afghan withdrawal on its merits, but like I'm not stupid. I know that people are not following 20 years of history for like why certain things happen, and they don't. They just turn the TV on one day and see people falling out of airplanes and like this is fucked up. This is crazy. I think they feel the same, very similarly about Ukraine. They feel very similarly about Israel. Beyond the actual like argument of like this and that, they're just like this is insanity. Like watching this happen just feels deeply chaotic. I encourage people to read the history of the Carter administration. The Carter administration was very similar. And, you know, it is so underestimated how much that hostage crisis sank him. You know, don't listen to me. Listen to Trump. It's kind of crazy. Trump has such a good diagnosis of Carter. I think because he's so old, he probably remembers it, where he's like, you know, it's not just the hostage things that sank him, it was the Panama Canal. Nobody today thinks about the Panama Canal Treaty, but multiple senators lost re-election because they voted for the treaty. Ronald Reagan made his bones in 78 on the back of the Panama Canal Treaty. We built it. We shouldn't give it back. Jonathan Alter in his book portrays it as a good, whatever. I'm not going to debate the merits of what the treaty itself, but reading it and seeing the political reaction at the time, the feeling of America in retreat, of America embarrassed, of America chaotic at home and abroad. It was just a nightmare. And that's why, beyond the actual questions of how to handle these things, handling them in a way as if it feels like there's a steady hand on the wheel is the most important thing in politics.
Yeah, and this is why one of the big debates from a historical perspective over the past few years has been what year is it in the sense of the Biden presidency? So in many ways, this rhymes with 1968. You've got a literal Kennedy, a literal
Yeah.
RFK running against, in many ways, actually literally the incumbent president. You have protests, you have foreign wars that are dictating domestic policy and really detracting from the claim that this is an era of progressive legislative progress. You've got the 70s, so Carter, the malaise, the inflation, hostages, those different things. And then if you're Joe Biden, you wanted it to be 1984. I say this again, I always say this on the podcast, but it really matters. The whole entire Joe Biden theory of the case is that Reaganomics equals Bidenomics, not in terms of the actual policy, but in terms of like, hey, we are using these policies to actually like get America going again and moving beyond all of the chaos and dissatisfaction people feel, and then we're going to be resoundingly reelected because it's morning in America again. If Biden had had a successful 2023, we literally in August of 2024 would have seen a ad directly inspired by Morning in America. They were gonna do the same exact thing, and it would have been a good ad if the actual political theory had worked. I think the final consensus on the Biden ad is it's the Carter years, right? Like
Yeah.
it's the Carter years, and the biggest problem too, and this is also why you've got a bunch of like left populists. I've had a bunch of them on this podcast jumping into the fray, trying to now argue, okay, so like there's clearly this populist moment. Like we need to sort of get back in touch with the working class via healthcare and minimum wage and all these different issues. But the thing I say to them off the recording is like, look, you guys need to read The Unwinding, which to this day is the best book on modern American politics. And I think if you read The Unwinding, George Packer 2013, The Unwinding is basically his way of articulating this idea that for the past, dude, since the start of this century, right? It's felt like the country is coming apart in different ways. And Obama is able to sort of push through that dynamic because of people personally liking him and the fact that he just is a generational political talent. But what less talented politicians, Trump in his 2016 to in his 2017 to 2021 iteration, Biden in his late stage iteration, and then Hillary Clinton in her late stage 2016 iteration, they have not been able to arrest this sense that America is on the decline. And America being on the decline, people feeling like their lives and the sort of narratives that drive them are sort of breaking apart is not something that's just fixed by like saying universal health care three times too fast or by saying, hey, let's have a higher minimum wage. So there's just like a real gap. And I think this is Trump's like strongest, because when I did my episode of Chris Murphy earlier this week, so the week before this episode comes out, I did this kind of thing, which I was kind of frustrated at his answer because I basically said, look, you say that the future of American politics is a left populism versus right populism fight. The problem for you guys on the left populist side is that the right populist side, they've got the econ there. So they're like, look, we're going to bring your jobs back and have American dominance via aggressive tariffs, aggressive deregulation, and just actually getting these things done. That's our deal. That's our thing. We're actually going to get the capital to show up in your actual factory towns. The Biden people couldn't do it because they're feckless and slow. We are going to recognize that from our perspective, bringing in all these like illegal immigrants is going to like take away your jobs. It's going to increase your houses. It's going to increase your housing prices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and by the way, all these people who like were in charge of getting this stuff done for Biden were a bunch of woke idiots who like were too concerned about DEI mandates and not about actually making your lives better. That's right populism. I think when you compare that to left populism, which is like universal health care, minimum wage increases, talk about unions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's got an economic bent to it, right? That's clearly different than the 2016 Hillary presidency, but it's not a good socio-cultural critique of the status quo. And right populism, we're separating like the actual like impacts of these actual policies. Right populism is just so much more of a better pitch to people in an unwinding America. Chris Murphy's response was, okay, sure, in the abstract, I think that's a fair point to make, but good luck making that pitch, JD Vance in 2028, after Elon and Vivek say that we need to cut Social Security for 4 years. He's like, we just had a big budget deal fight in DC in December where Republicans tried to pay for upper income tax cuts with cuts on Social Security and cuts on Medicare. So, like, the JD wing of the party that I think you identify with in many respects has less power outside of podcasts than it does in these actual fights. What's just your take on this big whole thing here?
I think he's right. I actually think that's correct in the immediate term. And if I was a Democrat, that's exactly what I would bet on. I would bet on an overreach and attempt to cut something like the Rick Scott plan from 2022
What
about
was
Social
that? Because this
Security.
was a whole thing
Rick Scott put out a plan, unauthorized plan, by the way,
for the
but he ended
Republican,
up
as the head of the Republican senatorial
NRC.
committee.
Yeah.
So for the entire country.
Yeah, he put out a plan being like, we need to cut spending, we need to raise the retirement age, we need to cut Social Security. It was a disaster, right? Just politically, if you
The
want to
Trump base doesn't want that. Like,
yeah,
that's the funny
exactly. I
thing.
mean, people don't. Yeah, people don't want that. So yeah, it's very conceivable to watch, maybe the tech right or somebody else, and if you could see the left critique of this is just like oligarchic giveaway, you could easily see that take hold. If there was a very, very unpopular tax bill that is passed, it's basically exactly what happened the last time around. Midterms is going to be a big test of all of this, and don't in Obama's words, and also don't underestimate congressional Republicans' ability to fuck things up. Really don't. Debt limits, free, reconciliation with razor sharp margins in the House. This is not going to be simple, easy. Trump is also a victim of the coalition that he put together, which literally doesn't agree on anything, as evidenced by the H-1B fight but the H-1B thing is just a microcosm because H-1B and all that represents also big business interests. He's going to be pro crypto, pro tariff. I mean, pro strong dollar, pro crypto. It's like, okay. The point is that the irreconcilability is the point. That's what political coalitions actually look like. Really good politicians are able to massage that extremely well. His strong suit is not governance. Usually a lot of what happens is the stuff we made at the cabinet level. It will then explode into like a thing and he will have to deal with it, and he sometimes doesn't really know how and like what he's doing. So the right and the left hand don't necessarily know what they're doing, and that's going to be hard. That is going to be very hard. I would not bet against Democratic victory in the midterms or Democratic victory in the next presidency. It's easily conceivable. I also wouldn't bet against a JD Vance victory in 2028. If you consider, I mean, look, the fundamentals are, I would say, in JD's direction, just knowing exactly what I know right now. You've got a political theory of governance. You've got generic-ish mandate. Macroeconomically, things are kind of going in your direction. We had high inflation, we had high interest rates. Those are probably going to go down ish over the next couple of years. Nobody's expecting a miracle, or maybe they are. And then if they are, you're screwed. Don't start any new major conflicts. Just more of this ceasefire stuff. Keep it going, and then just don't do anything all that crazy for 4 years. It's not that hard, right? I mean, and actually not even 4 years, 3 years, because you start running in 2027. So or 18 months before the election.
Midterms, yeah.
Yeah, so you got 2.5 years. Don't fuck things up. That's not a long time. That's just not that long before you actually have to run. So you could see it. I could see that too. But I could also see. Look, I mean, you're always at the mercy of foreign affairs. You have no idea what's going to happen. Putin says, "Fuck you. I'm actually going to take all of Ukraine." Now you're like, "Oh shit!" Now we have a feeling of chaos. You could see the tax bill massively backfiring. You could see, Republicans getting too over their skis like they did in '05 with privatization of Social Security. You could see a big win, for example, right, by the Freedom Caucus types or whatever, and they cut benefits by 8% of discretionary spend. I mean, that would be a lot, right? People would actually feel that. All of these things you could see happening. You could see more chaos at the border, right? Because if they don't competently execute that, you could see a major market crash as well. It may have nothing to do with them, but which you're going to have to deal with. COVID is a perfect example. Who in the beginning of Trump's term is like, yeah, he's going to get taken out by a pandemic.
I think Trump would
So you
have,
have no idea.
I think Trump had a more of a, considering how close the final
Yeah.
November 2020 result was. I think Trump without COVID probably wins re-election.
There's
So
no
that's just like
question
a
in my mind
perfect
that he wins
example.
re-election. Yeah.
What's that?
There's no question in my mind he would win re-election if there had been no COVID.
Right? Because
Zero.
COVID was just sort
Yeah.
of unironically made in a lab to
Right.
expose all of the weakest parts of the Trump presidency.
Yes.
The chaos, the annoying press conferences, the me. And once again, and Biden was then the perfect candidate at the time to rebuttal to that. Hey,
Yep.
say what you want about the Obama years, but don't you, the voter who's swinging in these counties in Pennsylvania, think that me and Barack would have done a better job of it? That's a
Yeah.
good pitch, and that was that. What and that was like the actually like good. And by the way, I'm the normal guy. I do think, and this is where I've been talking to folks usually on the left on the podcast, and just like in private to people on the right. The tech right is a huge problem for Trump right now. Because this is the kind of the point. Like this is the unwieldy coalition. Like my the sort of peak of like, okay, if this thing doesn't work out, this is going to be. It was basically the way the tech right handled the November period. So with this starts with Jason Calacanis, who's not in the tech right, but because he's like the moderator of All In, like speaks for people in that cohort. He starts by saying, "This is going to be a period of sacrifice, and we're going to have to make all these cuts, and it's going to be tough on all of it." It's like, dude, no, it's not, man. You made hundreds of millions of dollars from an Uber sale. You've got a big ranch in Austin. None of this is going to be a problem for you. And I actually like, and this keeps happening when I talk to people on the tech right. Like, I have not met a single person on the tech right other than literally. And the funny thing is, like, obviously, I think people overstate like the JD as venture capitalist part of his narrative because he worked in VC for 4 years, but like he wasn't. I mean, he was the GP
Hmm.
for a while of his own firm, but like that's not where he's rooted, right? Like he's still rooted in his early 2010s. The GOP is broken. These things don't work. He read the same things that you and I read back then. I need to actually find a way to make this coalition actually make sense and deliver for voters who are much more like my family back home. All these tech right people think that their mandate is to come in and cut Social Security and cut Medicaid.
Yep.
They think when people hear Doge, they're saying, oh, yeah, cut government spending in ways that would obviously affect the working class of the country. What they're really saying, though, and this is where it's like frustrating, because you know what's funny? RFK totally gets this. So what's great about if I'm sort of like going to sort of give like the bull case for RFK as a political actor, RFK gets that his mandate right now, let's put aside the vaccine stuff. If RFK comes into the FDA and just sort of kicks down a bunch of doors and says, "This is crazy. What's been going on here the past 20 years? Why is there all this crazy stuff?" You know, man, he's going to be traveling around the country. He's going to take his shirt off. He's going to do some like pull-ups that aren't actually real pull-ups. He needs to work on his form a bit there. But like, that's his deal. When people see like be anti-institutional, kick the sort of like doors down, that's what people are talking about. They are not talking about a bunch of tech billionaires come in and say, "Hey, we're going to save America from the debt via cutting your social security," because that was a disaster for Bush. Because when you were referencing Bush in '05, like once again, our younger listeners do not know this. The quote from Bush was, "I have political capital now. I didn't have political capital in 2001 because I didn't win the popular vote and it was weird. My mandate is to privatize Social Security. I'm going to create an ownership society where we do all these big free market things." I don't think Trump has the instinct to do that. And I think it should be noted, like Susie Wiles has been like, that's why she sort of pushed Doge to the side and made them very much not a West Wing project. I noted this, and this was so funny. People have been debating where Vivek goes after the H-1B fight, and then after his like big Twitter screed about how Americans need to be more like tiger kids and not go to sleepovers or do any of those things. There's a reason why Trump was like, Vivek, you really do need to run for senator of Ohio. I know you said you didn't want, but you really should consider. They're trying to get Vivek out of there,
Hmm.
because the thing with Elon is Elon like at least I think Elon brings value to because he's Tesla guy, right? Like, but Vivek is just trying to sneak college libertarianism into Trumpism. He was very explicit about this. He gave a big speech. People should really look at this. Like, and once again, I think JD would cream Vivek in a 2028 primary. It wouldn't even be funny. Even if like JD wasn't the VP, I think he would beat him because I think JD's a more talented politician. And the thing that people underestimate about JD is JD's most impressive feature is his ability to learn and grow as a politician. Like, dude, you and I met JD back in 2015, 2016. Right. Back then, he was sort of like he'll say this, he was a wallflower, right? He was like
Hmm.
kind of nervous guy. He's a nerdy guy who like wrote this book that got really big because of the Trump candidacy. And it's like, oh, what am I doing here? The level that he's grown over the past 8 years has been like very, very, very impressive. And, if people are going to assume that Cat Lady's 2021 JD is going to be the JD of 2028, that's just not going to be a thing. So I'm going to really judge politicians by their ability to grow in the JD sense. Because I think that's a really important metric there. But the key thing here is Vivek does not, I know that Vivek does not have that ability. He
100%.
gave a big speech in July of 2024 at the National Conservatism Conference. People should look this up because he basically was subtweeting JD. This was before JD was the nominee, but said there are basically two versions of Trumpism. There is like the nationalist populist version that JD embodies, and then there's my version, which is like much more libertarian, much more doji. And I think that's going to be the real fight there because Vivek doesn't have the political talent to pull it off, but the tech right would love if you actually took JD and Vivek out of it and said, "Hey, tech right, Vivek's vision, he called himself a national libertarian. National libertarianism versus national populism. The tech right is going to love
Yep.
national libertarianism.
Yes.
The issue is national libertarianism is basically just Paul Ryanism, just like not from DC. But
Yep.
that doesn't mean it's not politically toxic. So that's going to be the real inside baseball fight here.
Yeah, they're going to have a lot of trouble because they're going to find. I mean, look, we saw this exactly with the H-1B fight, is they're overinterpreting their mandate as to thinking like who they are with. And like people in Ohio did not vote for Donald Trump. Springfield, Ohio, okay, if we want to take it as extreme, which by the way, massively increases vote for Trump, did not vote for more H-1Bs for Facebook. I can very confidently say that. Now, you may try and utilize political power to get that for yourself. I think that's probably what's going to happen. But look, inevitably they're going to overreach. Like, and this all politicians do this. The real or all political projects, political coalitions, and all of this do this. Even the greatest ones. I think a lot about FDR, who I love
FDR
by the way.
and Reagan overreach.
Yeah.
Everyone
Yes.
overreaches.
Yes. I
Probably,
love,
who didn't overreach? Lincoln didn't overreach. Only because he
oh,
only had
that's
four
not
years.
necessarily true. No, no. He had major issues actually,
So
even
sorry, I
with
don't want to mean
Lincoln.
major issues.
Yeah.
I meant like at a like potentially cataclysmic level.
Sure.
That's more what I mean.
Here, I need to look up the 18. 1862 midterm elections did not go that well for
Hmm.
Abraham Lincoln. If you read a lot of Lincoln, this is again Lincoln. The biggest thing that ever happened, the worst thing that ever happened to Lincoln is he was turned into a god and not an ordinary human being. His own son said that, Robert Lincoln, because the guy who's a human being, and Daniel Day Lewis did a really good job of this, is way more interesting than the floating god above the
The
dais
last
who,
founder, the
yeah, the last
final.
philosopher king. He would have hated that description of himself. He was the scrappiest politician, one of the greatest to ever play the game. A huge, I would say almost 80% of his job was just coalitional management while he
A
was
team
in.
of
And
rivals
so
of sorts, Saga. That's
not
what you're
even
referring
that. He would
to.
have team of rivals in his cabinet, but I'm talking about like, well, yeah, we got a couple of these slave states. He famously said, I'd like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. And he's sitting there trying to figure out how to keep this coalition together. He's got literal traitors to his cause who are very popular politicians in Ohio. I think his name is Governor Vandenberg in Ohio and others who are straight up plotting to like have a Confederate peace. He's got the entire like Democratic Party and infrastructure in the state of New York actively campaigning against him, the center of financial power of the Union, who is actively opposed the electorate there to the entire project of freeing the slaves. Half of these generals are not even good at their job. Not even half. 90% of them are shit at their job. You only give them commissions because there's some moron commissioner or former official from the state. And the real generals were like, we need to get rid of these people. They suck. And he's like, sorry, I can't do it. And like, I need these people. They're
Congressmen got to
important
be
here.
generals. It was really, it
Right.
was a
Yeah.
disaster.
Literally, it was insane. It was insane. And by the way, a lot of people died because of that. It's a huge reason why we shouldn't have quote unquote like actual political generals in terms of plucking them out, giving them command of troops. But it was complicated because I mean at that
Different
time you
era.
also could elect your own, you could literally elect the colonel. Or if you had enough money, you could just buy a colonelcy. Crazy. My point is just that he he actually had a lot of things where, in terms of like his overreach, where he would overinterpret his mandate, for example, like suspending habeas corpus. There was a
Mhm.
big backlash. You know, everyone thinks we was all kumbaya during Civil War. No, 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 no. A lot of people did not agree with the Civil War. A lot of people hated the slaves, or they were fine with slavery. They didn't care. They just wanted to have it. Or a lot of people just said, "Fine, let them go." You know, why should we even have to deal with this? Most people don't, know anything about that, but it was a real time. But the FDR, my literal probably favorite politician. I think the literal greatest politician in the history of the United States. Even he, 1937, he's like, you know what? I'm a god. I'm a king. I'm going to stack the Supreme Court.
Because
And
he
the Senate was
wins the
just like,
greatest re-election in American
yeah,
history in 1930.
right,
He wins
literally.
it on guys on the side note, look up his 1936
It's
re-election.
insane.
Talk
Yeah.
about a mandate
Yeah,
on
right.
paper.
Right. He's like, I am a living God. He's like, I can do anything that I want. The court has struck down all of my New Deal initiatives that I was most excited about. They're a pain in my ass. Fuck them. I'm gonna stack the court. Nope. Massive. And he never ever ruled as a king again after the Supreme Court. He was still very popular. Don't get me wrong, but the 1940 election very different. They were like, man, we could actually lose this. There's some people are not very happy. There's an undercurrent of like conservatism and backlash to the New Deal and his pledge. Like, he has to very, very carefully kind of manage isolationism and his own internationalism and things. And I actually think that was very good for FDR because it brought him and rooted him back in the body politic of exactly what made him so good of a politician. And he never forgets that lesson and he carries it until the end of his life. Ronald Reagan, exactly. Great point. Same thing. Massively overinterprets his mandate. Then there's a recession in 1982. All of a sudden, he has to like bring back like Ronnie Jellybean media tour. He has to convince the country he's not too old. All of these people do it. And Trump is actually probably at the greatest risk of over interpreting his mandate because he literally doesn't have to run for president again. So he can
Yep.
do whatever he wants. So if I was trying to inherit his legacy, I would be afraid of actually of what to do with that. That's a little history lesson, but it's important for people to understand that. Can we also say then that that's a reason why term limits are bad? Because if Trump had to run for a third term, he would be more politically calibrated.
Well, what makes
Yeah.
Trump unique here is that typically a president's second term, they're instantly a lame duck. This
Right.
is just the conventional wisdom, and it's also largely true. But because this is the conventional taking on basically my perspective on the way I'm always thinking, because I like the big Oxford histories of the United States, like
Mm-hmm.
Freedom from Fear. I think the 2100 sort of story on this will be in the same way that we talk about how the 1960s didn't end until 1974 and the 1950s didn't end until 1963 of JFK's assassination. So like decades more complicated. I think people are going to say the 21st century did not truly end until November 2024.
Mm.
And so much of what we just experienced with the first, frankly, I think terrible first quarter of this 21st century was really just like wrapping up the 1980s and the 1990s. So because Trump is basically the first president of a new political era, he's going to have more leeway and be taken more seriously than a typical second term Trump would have been. Like, for example, if Trump had been reelected, like, would that have been like a successful second term? Probably not.
No, absolutely not.
In a weird way, probably even without COVID, right? So either like no COVID happens or Trump squeaks one out, because as you point out, 43,000 votes switch in 2020 and you get a second Trump presidency. Wouldn't have been as he would have been a total disaster. You would have had an instant coalitional breakout fight, whatever. But that's really the thing here. So because people are going to say like, look, like Trump has this vibe shift. That's gonna be the title of this episode. This is the Trump vibe shift episode. It does mean that he's going to have more leeway, but the more leeway you have, the more potential you have for that there. So I think that's all. I think that's all really, really well said. I think this has been a great episode for just sort of the basic piece of advice for everyone left, right, and center: get centered with things. And be overly concerned with over interpreting mandates. And I would just say that your comment on the Chris Murphy thing is well taken, just in the sense that like, yeah, there's just like a possibility that like the actions of the Trump presidency for the next 3 to 4 years could not serve the JD Vance 2028 campaign.
Oh, absolutely.
But once again, though, once having talked to a lot of populist progressives, I do just think they are over. The thing I think they're just wrong about is the idea that the up for grabs working class can be addressed purely through materialist
I
means.
agree. I mean,
I've
Crystal and
just
I
heard a
fight about
bunch
this
of
all the
people who are
time.
basically like, look, we get that they're not with us on sociocultural issues, but ultimately those things are a distraction. You can make an economic case. I just like, here's my challenge to progressives, and I'm not just saying this because I'm a centrist. People sort of think I'm making like a policy fight here. Like, prove it. Like,
Yeah.
actually unseat a Republican in 2026 via an economically populist attack. Like actually get it done. Don't just primary Democrats who are, because the problem is like
Osborne did all. Let's give him credit though. Osborne came close. He came closer
Osborne,
than any
Osborne, no,
other.
no, no, but no,
Yeah.
but this is the problem though. What did
Mm.
Osborne actually? This is why he's not the right case.
Yeah.
Osborne ran build the wall ads.
Yeah.
So like that's the thing. But and this is what my critique is. Osborne, I think, took the data seriously, which is okay, if we're gonna get working class people, we'd be economically populist, but we also be culturally conservative and match that mood. And what I've been frustrated from an empirical perspective on the progressive side is basically saying, look, I'm not gonna run build the wall ads. I'm not going to do a Sister Soldier moment, but I can make up for that with working class voters by saying I'm not a neoliberal Democrat. I'm not bought by Wall Street. And I think it's just missing something. I know a lot of people, like the advantage of like the Breaking Point cinematic universe is like we actually talk to a lot of people and we actually get
Mhm.
organic reach out. I have yet to actually encounter someone in that category who's like, oh yeah, the only thing stopping me from voting Democratic is the lack of pushing for a minimum wage increase.
Sure. Sure.
I think
Yeah.
that just does not reflect, to your point, the malaise of the country, the unwinding dynamic. And once again, that's not to say there can't be something there, but like the problem here is that like I've yet to hear a progressive Democrat navigate Bernie 2016 versus Bernie 2020, Bernie 2016 is anti-immigration. He's loved by the NRA. He's not culturally progressive. The 2020 version tries to be culturally progressive and economically populist, and there just isn't evidence that that's actually a like this is political operator Marshall speaking. I think everyone's sort of the thing that I'm encountering when I talk to everyone's sort of in the market for new ideas, and I think progressives are sort of getting over their skis and how like effective, quote unquote, pitching economic populism only at the economic level is when it actually comes to these union voters. Because I actually think they're mostly thinking, yeah, this union stuff's fine, it's good, but actually, like, I really care about the sociocultural bent of this country. So that's my last word on all of that.
Yep, I totally agree.
That is how we're ending this because we're totally in sync, and that's awesome. Sagar, this has been great. Talk to you later.